I've been tossing around a few ideas for how I would have remade Resident Evil 3 since long before that game actually came out. What we got is really good, but I think these ideas could still be employed elsewhere in the franchise. Yes, I'm talking about Resident Evil Revelations. Revelations began in 2012 as a survival horror alternative to the more action-focused direction the series was heading, but with Resident Evil 6 that same year not being as well received, Capcom took the main series back to its roots and made Revelations 2 as a kind of test for the potential of greater survival horror emphasis, drawing quite heavily on The Last of Us for mechanics. Now that the main series has found a good place with RE7 and the Raccoon remakes, Revelations should be used as a more experimental series to test out ideas that may not fit in the core survival horror games. We've seen survival horror, action horror, scavenging horror, but there's a particular type of horror we haven't really seen before: psychological horror. If you watched the Wasted Potential episode on Jill Valentine, you'll recall that the idea I proposed was to focus on Jill's post-mind control PTSD as she searched for the amnesiac Chris in Resident Evil 6. While 3 has some allusions to the idea of Jill suffering from post-traumatic stress, it's only alluded to with a nightmare at the start and is more an expansion of Jill's diary from the original, talking about the nightmares she's had since the mansion incident. But it could be a fantastic direction to go with the character and a way to reference her full history for her triumphant return to a timeline that's advanced 8 years since her last chronological appearance. Timeline-wise, the story could be set around the time of RE6 to explain Jill's absence from Chris's story there, also discussed on WP, or closer to RE7 so that her confrontation of her trauma is the final step to her return to the field in a mainline entry. Either way, after her time being manipulated by Wesker, Jill is taken a leave of absence from the BSAA and moved to a small town in the countryside. Chris or Barry can have a cameo at the start, helping her get settled in. Jill lives there for a while and everything seems to be going okay. However, there is a certain individual who has plans to bring Jill's peaceful life crashing down around her. They release a virus in the town, probably the T-virus, to harken back to Raccoon City. A lot of these events harken back to that actually. This outbreak is an orchestrated recreation of Raccoon, kinda like how MGS2 was a recreation of MGS1, complete with a pursuer monster or two to put Jill through hell. So Jill is trapped in a town overrun with zombies while a tough BOW is chasing her. Naturally, this begins to set off her PTSD. She can also be set off by her attempts to save someone from an infection with a sample of the cure, as injecting people reminds her of her time infecting the people of Kijuju on Wesker's behalf. Maybe there's a mercenary duo working for the mystery villain who are intentionally chosen to resemble Chris and Sheva to further set Jill off. The PTSD manifests in hallucinations of Nemesis and RE5 BOWs, and in gameplay with hampered aiming and movements when she has an episode. That's a setup for the story, but how would this game play? Well, the big shake-up is something I'm a little unsure of. My concept for a Resi 3 remake placed the player into a large sandbox in which Nemesis is constantly active and searching for the player, moving on when he finds no signs. Kinda like Mr. X in 2 but with a much larger map. He's attracted to loud sounds such as gunfire and explosions. The louder the sound, the further away he can hear it, the longer he'll search the area, and the more accurate his search will be. This can be a problem for Jill, but it can also be a useful tool. Perhaps the petrol station explosion isn't mandatory in this version. Maybe it's something the player can use to keep Nemesis busy for a while they go to another area. I'd use a similar concept here. Some of you are probably picturing something along the lines of The Evil Within 2, and you're not far off. Jill has to sneak around her pursuer and move intelligently to avoid a confrontation. Now, as for why I'm unsure about this, I don't know how much an open map might impact the narrative of Jill coping with her trauma, which might need a more tight and linear layout to stick the landing. Maybe the two ideas would work in tandem, but I'm not entirely sure. For the sake of argument, assume that they can. So, after evading the monster for hours using weather and distractions to mask her movements, Jill eventually uncovers the culprit's identity. Now, if you've not played 3 yet, this reveal will spoil some of that game's story, which may or may not differ from the original 3. This game is a sequel to RE3 in many ways, in terms of being an evolution of the Nemesis Pursuer concept, and in terms of narrative. The antagonist is Nikolai, whom Jill let live during 3, which causes Jill guilt once she realises this could have been avoided if she'd killed him back then. She destroyed his plans back then, and he's out for revenge. As for the question of why it took him so long to do this, he's been out of work since then, struggling to get by as a mercenary in war zones, and finally has the resources, plans and opportunity to act. The story could also work if it was set during the conflicts with Umbrella with post-Nemesis PTSD, but I think the post-5 PTSD works better. Nikolai becomes mutated, hoisted by his own petard, and Jill puts an end to him once and for all, probably with some reinforcements from Carlos and Barry. Carlos can have his own story that fills us in on what he's been up to since Raccoon, closing the book on RE3 for good. Of course, such a game couldn't be made in the next few years. With how much it calls back to 3, we'd need time to move away from 3 to avoid the tributes and parallels from feeling like a rehash. It's like how Yakuza 0 has a bunch of callbacks and references to the first game, which was then remade the following year. Put some distance between players and Resi 3 and then pull the trigger on this. If you liked this video, why not subscribe and support me on Patreon like these fine people here? If not, then make sure to share it with your enemies so they can suffer along with you. Today's recommended video is Nemesis vs Mr. X, Who's the Better Stalker by Gaming Bolt. It's an interesting discussion of how the two tyrants were reimagined in the remakes for good and for ill.